Do you know whose chair you are sitting in?
She sat in the chair reserved for dead men and asked for orange juice. Somewhere beneath her feet, 99 rules were carved in stone to keep a killer's heart from ever beating for anyone again. She never read the rules. She just broke them, one smile at a time. If you believe love should never be a rule someone has to break to survive, hit like and subscribe right now. Only the cold-hearted, the rule-obsessed, and the secret rule. 100 writers of this world would scroll past without smashing that button. Stay. The empire's about to crack wide open. Soul didn't do subtle rain. It came down in sheets, drumming against the black-tiled roof of the Kang estate like it had a personal vendetta, like it was trying to scrub 20 years of sins out of the stone. Somewhere beneath that roof, in a chamber lit by a single amber bulb, 99 rules were carved into a slab of obsidian. Men who worked for Kang Min-jae memorized those rules before they memorized their own phone numbers. It was cheaper that way. Phone numbers changed. The rules never did. Rule 7. Never trust strangers. Rule 19. Never reveal weakness. Rule 51. Never fall in love. Rule 99. Never forgive betrayal. Read together. They sounded less like a code of conduct and more like a eulogy. Somebody had written for a boy who used to laugh, back before the world decided he wasn't allowed to anymore. Min Jae had built an empire on that eulogy. Smuggling routes stitched through 3 ports. Judges who owed him favors they prayed daily he'd never collect. A reputation so cold that grown men who'd stared down loaded guns without blinking, crossed themselves when his car idled too long at a red light. He ran Seoul's underworld the way other men ran spreadsheets. No feeling, no error, no exceptions. Ever. Which is exactly the kind of man the universe loves to humble. And the universe, it turns out, has a wicked sense of humor and impeccable timing, because that's precisely when it sent him Amara Johnson. She didn't arrive with a knife in her boot or a wire under her blouse. She arrived with a tackle box full of pigments, 3 tiny brushes rolled in linen, and a plane ticket paid for by an insurance company that had flagged her as the only restoration artist on the continent qualified to save a 300-year-old painting that had nearly gone up in flames, along with half the estate's east wing. Amara didn't do organized crime. She did gesso, patience, and the quiet, stubborn art of making broken things whole again, a skill set about to be applied to something considerably more fragile than canvas, though nobody in that mansion knew it yet. She didn't know that Kang Min-jae's name made grown men disappear, literally, not metaphorically, though the mansion staff were vague on the details whenever she asked. She only knew his chair at the breakfast table caught the best morning light, so she sat in it. The room went so still you could hear dust settle on the chandelier. Somewhere near the doorway, a bodyguard the size of a delivery truck briefly forgot how lungs worked. Amara buttered her toast in the seat reserved, unofficially, for death itself, and looked around at 6 of the most dangerous men in East Asia, staring at her like she'd just set the tablecloth on fire. "Why?" she asked, entirely unbothered. "Does nobody in this house know how to laugh? Did somebody outlaw it? Or is it just bad for the property value?" Nobody answered. Nobody dared. A silence spread through the room thick enough to spread on toast itself. Kang Min-jae stood in the doorway, tailored black suit, expression carved from the same obsidian as his rules, and simply stared at her the way a man stares at a fire alarm going off in the middle of a very important, very illegal meeting. Something inconvenient. Something that would eventually have to be dealt with. He didn't order her removed. Not yet. He told himself it was because the painting mattered. 300 years of provenance, insurance clauses, appearances to maintain. He did not tell himself the real reason, which was that nobody, in 20 years, had looked at him and seen a man instead of a warning label. By the time the sun dropped behind Seoul's skyline that evening, Amara had broken 7 of his 99 rules without even trying. She'd spoken to a stranger, questioned an order, laughed in a room built for silence. She hadn't read the stone tablet. She didn't need to. Some rules, it turns out, only exist because nobody's ever been foolish enough or brave enough to test them. Min-jae watched her walk the halls of his mansion like she owned them, humming some off-key tune under her breath, utterly unaware that she had just become the single greatest threat his empire had faced in 2 decades. Not a rival gang, not a federal agent. A woman with a paintbrush, and zero respect for expensive chairs. Somewhere in the walls, in rooms he never entered, a black envelope was already being written. Somebody, in that mansion, had been waiting 20 years for a woman just like her to walk through that door. They just hadn't expected her to sit down first. By the end of the first week, Amara Johnson had done something no assassin, rival cartel, or federal task force had managed in 20 years. She'd made Kang Min-jae's household completely, catastrophically unpredictable. It started with the dog. The estate's guard dog was a 300-pound mass of muscle and menace named, in the original Korean, something that translated roughly to Death's Shadow. He'd taken a chunk out of a rival enforcer's calf the previous spring and had, as a direct result, never once been petted, praised, or spoken to in anything but barked commands. He was less a pet than a loaded weapon that happened to have fur. Amara took one look at him, crouched down to his eye level while 6 security guards nearly had cardiac events, and said, "You look like a cupcake to me." Death's Shadow, now, apparently, Cupcake, put his enormous head in her lap and sighed like a man finally getting to take his tie off after a 16-hour shift. The guards stared. Somewhere, an ancestor's spirit wept. "That dog has killed a man," the head of security informed her, aghast. "He seems like he's working through some things," Amara said, scratching behind Cupcake's ear. "Aren't we all?" Min-jae watched this exchange from the second-floor window with the particular horror of a man watching his entire operational philosophy get undone by a woman with a paintbrush and a nickname habit. His father, may his memory rest, if not in peace, then at least in profitable silence, used to say a leader's authority was only as strong as the fear surrounding it. Cupcake was currently rolling onto his back for belly rubs. The fear was evaporating fast. It got worse in the meetings. Amara had no concept of closed door as it applied to her. She wandered into a sit-down with 3 shipping contacts from Busan wearing paint-splattered overalls and carrying a thermos of tea, sat down uninvited, and listened to Min-jae deliver a speech about loyalty and consequence with all the warmth of a bank statement. When he finished, she raised her hand like she was in a lecture hall. "Can I say something? You talk like a fortune cookie that gave up on optimism halfway through printing. Loyalty is the foundation. Okay, and? Foundation of what? A parking garage? Give the people something to actually believe in." The Busan contacts didn't know whether to laugh or flee. Min-jae's jaw worked silently for several seconds, the closest thing to visible rage his face had produced in years, before he simply excused himself from his own meeting. Not because he was furious himself from his own meeting. Not because he was furious. Because if he stayed one more second, he was afraid of what his face might do next. Somewhere between offended and amused was a country he hadn't visited in 20 years, and he didn't trust the border crossing. That night, over kitchen leftovers meant for cartel executives, Amara ladled soup into paper cups and walked 2 blocks to a cluster of homeless kids sleeping rough near the docks. She didn't ask permission. She didn't consider that the food had been prepared at considerable expense for men who moved untraceable money through 6 countries. To her, dumplings were dumplings, and hungry was hungry, and the math wasn't complicated. Min-jae found out the next morning when his chef reported the missing trays with the terror of a man delivering news of a coup. He said nothing. He simply looked for a long moment at the empty containers, and something in his chest, buried under 99 rules like a body under wet concrete, shifted half an inch. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many rules do we all build? Quiet, private, unspoken ones, just to protect ourselves from ever being disappointed again. And how much do we lose, protecting ourselves from a hurt that might never even come? If you've ever built a wall so good it kept out the very thing you needed most, drop a comment below. Only the ones still clinging to a rulebook written out of fear would stay silent. The soldiers noticed the shift too, and soldiers, being soldiers, did not appreciate uncertainty. Word moved through the mansion in the particular hush of men deciding whether their boss had gone soft or simply gone mad. A woman renaming the dog was a joke. A woman feeding street children with cartel money was a liability. A woman making Kang Min-jae hesitate, even for half a second, even once, was something else entirely. That night, tucked beneath the collar of a very confused, very happy Cupcake, the first black envelope appeared. Min-jae read it alone, by lamplight, in the room with the 99 rules. It said nothing about the dog, or the soup, or the meeting. It said only, watch her closely. Some rules were written for a reason you were never told. He set the envelope down on the obsidian slab, right beside Rule 99, and for the first time in 20 years, felt genuinely, thoroughly afraid. There was one room in the Kang estate that no one entered. Not the maids, who dusted around its locked door like it was a live grenade. Not the security detail, who'd long since stopped asking why. Not even Min Jae himself, most days. He simply walked past it the way you walk past a wound you've decided to stop checking on, hoping distance might do what time never had. Amara obviously opened it. She wasn't snooping. She told herself that anyway, as she wandered the east wing looking for better light to work on the damaged painting, and found instead a locked cabinet with a hinge so old it practically begged to be picked. In fairness to her conscience, the lock gave up almost immediately, like it had been waiting 20 years for someone to finally ask. Inside was a photograph, cracked clean down the middle like it had been dropped or thrown, or perhaps just held too many times by hands that shook. A woman with a gentle, tired smile. A boy of maybe 7, solemn-eyed even then, holding her hand like he already understood how easily it could be taken away. Amara didn't need a name tag to know who the boy was. She'd seen that same solemn expression across the breakfast table every morning for 2 weeks. She didn't ask permission. She never did. She simply carried the photograph to her workstation, mixed her adhesives, and spent 4 careful hours doing what she did best, coaxing something broken back into something whole. When Min Jae found it, restored, sitting upright on his desk that evening, he didn't say a word for a long time. He just stood there, a man built entirely out of 99 rules, staring at his mother's face for the first time in 2 decades without the crack running straight through her smile. "You had no right," he finally said, though his voice had none of its usual iron in it. "Probably not," Amara agreed, not looking up from her tea. "But somebody should have fixed that a long time ago, and it clearly wasn't going to be you. You don't know anything about my parents." "No," she said. "But I know what a person looks like when they're carrying something they never got to put down. And for the record, that's not a rule you can carve into a rock and forget about. Grief doesn't respect stone." He wanted to be furious. He'd spent 20 years perfecting fury as a first response. It was cheaper than grief, cleaner than memory. But standing there, looking at his mother's restored smile, the fury simply refused to arrive on schedule, like a soldier who'd finally decided he was done taking orders. "They died in a fire," he said instead, quiet, almost surprised at himself for saying it out loud. "I was 7. Nobody ever told me why." Amara set her tea down. She didn't reach for him, didn't offer some hollow comfort about time healing things. She'd fixed enough broken paintings to know that healing was never passive. It was work, deliberate and slow and often painful before it was beautiful. "Then maybe," she said, "it's time somebody found out." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the room with the 99 rules, the black envelope still resting where he'd left it days before, and read Rule 99 over and over. Never forgive betrayal. He'd always assumed that rule was about enemies, rivals, traitors in his own ranks. It had never once occurred to him, until that moment, that the rule might have been written about the very people responsible for his parents' deaths. People who might still be standing close enough to touch. Reflect on this with me for a second. How many of us are protecting rules that were actually written to protect somebody else's secret, not our own safety? If you've ever realized the wall you built was guarding the wrong thing entirely, I want to hear about it below. Because Amara is about to find out exactly whose secret those 99 rules were really built to hide. By morning, his soldiers noticed something had shifted again. Something deeper than a renamed dog or a canceled meeting. Min Jae, for the first time anyone could remember, requested the estate's old staffing records. Every name, every hire, every person present the night of the fire 20 years ago. Somewhere in those records, unnoticed and unremarkable for 2 decades, was a name that would explain everything. The envelopes, the missing rule, the fire that was never fully investigated, and the reason someone in that house had been waiting patiently for 20 long years. For a woman exactly like Amara to walk through the door and finally light the fuse. The staffing records, it turned out, were exactly as boring as 20-year-old employment paperwork tends to be until Amara, bored one rainy afternoon and increasingly incapable of minding her own business, offered to help sort through them while Min Jae worked through household accounts he clearly hated with his entire soul. "You hate spreadsheets," she observed, watching him glare at a column of numbers like it had personally insulted his ancestors. "I hate incompetence," he said. "Spreadsheets simply happen to document it." "Sure, keep telling yourself that, fortune cookie." The nickname had stuck, much to his visible suffering and everyone else's poorly concealed delight. Even Cupcake, upon hearing it, had taken to nudging Min Jae's hand whenever Amara said it, as if the dog, too, found it deeply satisfying. It was Amara who found the discrepancy, not because she was looking for it, but because restoration work had taught her to notice when something didn't match its frame. A payroll entry from 21 years ago listed a housekeeper named Song Hae-won. Standard enough, except the woman's employment records ended abruptly 6 months before the fire, with no resignation letter, no severance payment, no forwarding address. She simply vanished from the paperwork the way names only vanish when somebody very deliberately erases them. "People don't just disappear from a filing cabinet," Amara said, sliding the folder across the table. "Somebody has to want them gone hard enough to do the erasing." Min Jae studied the entry for a long moment, something cold moving behind his eyes. Not his usual practiced coldness, but something older, more uncertain. "Song Hae-won worked in this house when my parents died, and then she just stopped existing on paper. 6 months before the fire that killed them." Amara tapped the folder. "That's not a coincidence, Min Jae. That's a cover-up with really lazy handwriting." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a second file from beneath a false panel in his desk. A panel Amara hadn't known existed until that exact moment, which told her everything about how many other secrets that desk was quietly holding. Inside was a slim, leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle, its ink faded to the color of dried tea. He'd inherited it after his uncle's death years ago, and never once had the stomach to read past the first page. They read it together that night, by amber lamplight, in the room with the 99 rules, which suddenly felt less like scripture and more like a very elaborate alibi. The ledger detailed payments, large ones, routed through shell accounts, timed suspiciously close to the fire, and tucked between two brittle pages, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, was a photograph. A Korean boy of maybe 7, holding hands with a laughing black girl roughly his age, both squinting into summer sunlight neither of them remembered. "That's not possible," Min Jae said, staring at it. "I don't know that girl. I don't know that boy," Amara said, just as quietly. "But I know that smile. I've seen it in a mirror my whole life. Something passed between them then. Not romance. Not yet." Though the soldiers watching from the hallway would later swear the air in that room changed temperature. It was recognition. The particular vertigo of realizing that the story you've been told about your own life might have entire chapters missing, deliberately torn out by someone who benefited from your not knowing. Here's something worth sitting with, and I want your honesty in the comments. How much of what we believe about our own past was actually handed to us by someone with a reason to lie? If you've ever pulled a thread on your own history and found something nobody wanted you to see, tell me below, because Amara's about to pull the last thread, and whoever's been writing envelopes in the dark is running out of house to hide in. Min Jae closed the ledger slowly, his hands unsteady in a way 20 years of discipline had never once allowed. "Song Hae-won," he said. "If she's alive, she's the only person left who can tell us what actually happened that night." Amara stood, brushing dust from her overalls, looking every bit as unbothered by an international crime syndicate's darkest secret as she'd been about sitting in his chair on day one. "Then I guess," she said, "we go find her." Outside, the rain hadn't stopped once since she'd arrived, as if Seoul itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether the truth, once finally uncovered, would wash the estate clean or drown it entirely. Finding a woman who'd been erased from every official document in South Korea should have taken weeks. It took 3 days, mostly because Amara refused to accept the trails gone cold as an answer to anything, ever, and dragged Min Jae through a very undignified afternoon of visiting elderly former estate staff with homemade banana bread as a bribe. "You're bribing retired Mafia housekeepers with baked goods," Min Jae said, watching her knock on the 4th door of the day. "Everybody talks for banana bread," Amara said. "Grief loosens up real nice around carbs." She was infuriatingly correct. By the 3rd house, an elderly former cook mentioned, between grateful bites, that Song Hae-won had a sister who ran a small tea shop 2 hours outside the city, and that nobody from the estate had ever bothered to check because nobody from the estate had ever cared enough to look. They found Song Hae-won behind the counter of that tea shop, older now, gray-haired, her hands steady around a kettle in a way that suggested she'd spent 20 years deliberately building a life too quiet to be found. When she saw Min Jae's face, the kettle nearly slipped from her grip. "You look just like him," she whispered. "Just like your father." What followed wasn't the tidy confession of a movie villain. It was worse. The slow, exhausted unburdening of a woman who'd been carrying a secret so heavy it had bent her whole life around its shape. 21 years ago, Song Hae-won had worked in the Kang household alongside another housekeeper, her own sister in fact, secretly married to Min Jae's uncle, a man who'd wanted the empire for himself and resented watching his brother run it instead. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been arranged, quietly, efficiently. The way everything in that house eventually was, a coup dressed up as tragedy. Song Hae-won hadn't set the fire, but she'd known. And knowing, in a house that ran on 99 rules about loyalty and silence, had made her as guilty as the man who struck the match. She'd fled the moment she could, changed her name in every ledger she could reach, and spent 2 decades hoping the truth would simply stay buried with the rest of the ash. "Your uncle wrote those rules with your father," she said. 99 of them, side by side, back when they still trusted each other. But your uncle always said there should be a 100th rule. One nobody else was allowed to see. One only he got to enforce. She looked at Amara then, something like pity in her tired eyes. "He wrote it the week you arrived, child. He's been waiting 20 years for someone to walk into that house and finally make Min Jae feel something again. Because a man who feels nothing can't be threatened. But a man who's finally happy?" She shook her head. "That man can be controlled by fear of losing it." The photograph, she explained, was simple once you knew the shape of it. Amara's own mother had briefly worked for the Kang family decades ago, before returning to the States with a small daughter in tow, never knowing the true reason her contract had ended so abruptly, never knowing she'd witnessed something Min Jae's uncle needed erased. 2 children, photographed once by accident, connected now by a secret neither had chosen and both had inherited. Min Jae sat very still through all of it. 20 years of carefully constructed certainty dissolving in a tea shop that smelled like jasmine and old grief. The uncle he'd trusted, the man who'd stood beside him at both his parents' funeral and his own coronation as head of the empire, had been the architect of both tragedies, using rules meant to protect the family as a leash to control it instead. Here's a question I think we all need to sit with, and I want your honesty below. How many of the rules in our own lives, the ones we assume exist to protect us, are actually just somebody else's leash, dressed up as wisdom? If you've ever discovered the person guarding you was the one who put you in danger to begin with, I want to hear it in the comments, because Min Jae's about to walk back into that mansion and confront the man who orchestrated his entire life's grief. And there is no version of that conversation that ends quietly. "Rule number 100, Min Jae said finally, standing, his voice steady in a way that frightened Amara more than any anger could have. "She must die." He looked at Amara like he was seeing, for the first time, exactly how close his uncle's leash had come to closing. "My uncle didn't write that rule to protect the empire. He wrote it because you made me human again, and a human being can be hurt. He needs me broken to keep controlling me." Amara met his eyes, unshaken, the same way she'd met them across that breakfast table on day one. "Then I guess," she said quietly, "it's time we broke something of his instead." Word moves fast in an empire built on fear. Faster still when the fear finally has somewhere to point. By the time Min Jae and Amara returned to the estate, his uncle, Kang Tae-sung, had already summoned every captain, every elder, every quiet enforcer with a stake in the family's future, all gathered under the pretense of an emergency council. Tae-sung had spent 20 years perfecting the art of getting ahead of a story before it could get ahead of him. He intended to stand before the room and explain, calmly, reasonably, why his nephew's judgment had been compromised by a foreign woman who didn't understand their world, and why, for the good of the family, she needed to be removed. Permanently. He hadn't planned on his nephew walking in first. The great hall of the Kang estate had never held so many people who were simultaneously furious confused and quietly terrified. Captains lined the walls. Elders sat in stiff rows like a jury that had already decided the verdict and was only waiting for the formality of a trial. Tisung stood at the head of the room, composed as ever, a man who'd built his second act entirely out of other people's grief. "Nephew," he said smoothly, as Min Jae entered with Amara a step behind him. "You've spared me the trouble of sending for you. Sit. We have a difficult matter to discuss." "We do," Min Jae agreed, his voice eerily calm, the calm of a man who had already decided how the night would end. "Let's discuss rule number 100. Something flickered behind Tisung's eyes. Small, quick, gone almost before it registered. But rooms full of dangerous men are very good at reading small, quick things. A murmur moved through the captains like wine through dry grass. "I don't know what you mean," Tisung said. "You wrote 100th rule into a stone slab you had no right to touch," Minjae said, stepping closer. "You wrote it the week Amara arrived. Not because she was a threat to this family's business, because she was a threat to the one thing you've spent 20 years making sure I never had, a reason to feel anything at all. A man who feels nothing is easy to control, Uncle. A man who's finally happy asks questions." "You're being sentimental," Tisung said, and for the first time, something brittle crept into his composure. "That woman has clouded your judgment." "Song Hye-won says hello," Amara said. The room went utterly still. Taesung's face didn't move, but his hands did. A small, involuntary tightening at his sides. The first honest thing his body had done in 20 years of practiced stillness. "She's told us everything," Min Jae continued. And now there was iron in his voice again, but a different iron than before. Not the cold of a man protecting an empire, but the heat of a man finally protecting himself. "The fire, the payments, the rules you and my father wrote together as brothers, before you decided you'd rather rule alone than share anything with him ever again." Before Tai Sung could answer, before the captains could fully process what they were hearing, Amara walked past all of them, past the frozen elders and the wide-eyed enforcers, straight to the black stone monument standing at the center of the hall, the same slab that had governed every life in that house for 2 decades, glowing faint and amber under its single bowl like some kind of twisted altar. She picked up the hammer that had been resting, almost ceremonially, beside it for polishing the stone's edges, and swung. The 99 rule shattered into gravel, dust rising in the amber light, like smoke from a fire 20 years overdue. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Min Jae, who'd known it was coming, felt something in his chest crack loose alongside the stone. Amara looked directly at Kang Tae-sung. Not at Min Jae, not at the captains, not at anyone, but the man who had orchestrated a family's entire grief to keep his leash tight, and said, quiet as a blade sliding home, "Your rules didn't save anybody. They only kept a scared little boy from ever finding out he was allowed to be happy." The silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then Tae-sung reached, quick as a man with nothing left to lose, for the pistol at his side, and the captains who had spent 20 years memorizing 99 rules about loyalty finally had to decide, in real time, which man in that room actually deserved it. If you believe the truth should always be allowed to break the rules built to hide it, hit subscribe before Chapter 7, because only the people still loyal to men like Tae-sung would look away right now. Time does strange things in the half-second before a gunshot. Min Jae would later swear the whole room seemed to hold its breath along with him. Captains frozen mid-decision. Elders too stunned by 20 years of unraveling to react. Cupcake, who had somehow wandered in through an unlatched door, letting out a low growl that cut through the silence like the world's least dignified alarm bell. It was Cupcake in the end who moved first, lunging at the one man in the room he'd apparently decided, with the simple clarity dogs sometimes have that humans lack, was the actual threat. Taesung's shot went wide, shattering a lamp instead of a person, and by the time he hit the floor with 90 pounds of loyal, badly named muscle pinning his arm, the captains had finally, collectively, remembered which side of history they wanted to be standing on. Nobody stepped in to help him up. "Rule number 100 is off the wall now," Min Jae said quietly, standing over his uncle with a stillness that was somehow more frightening than any rage could have been. "Along with the other 99, this family doesn't run on stone tablets anymore. It runs on the truth, starting with yours." What followed wasn't the swift, cinematic justice of a movie ending. It was slower, messier, and in its own way, far more satisfying. T-Sung didn't disappear into some convenient off-page fate. He was handed over, along with his ledgers, his shell accounts, and 20 years of carefully hidden financial rot, to exactly the kind of investigators an empire like his had spent decades bribing into irrelevance. It turned out that a man who'd built his second act on other people's silence had very few allies left once the silence broke. The captains who might once have protected him at gunpoint instead lined up, one by one, to hand over evidence, each of them suddenly very eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the nephew instead of the uncle. Song Hae-won came forward publicly 2 weeks later, finally free of the name she'd been hiding under for 20 years, and testified to exactly what she'd witnessed the night of the fire. She wept through most of it, not from fear this time, but from the strange, aching relief of finally putting a 20-year-old weight down. Min Jae rebuilt the Great Hall himself, tearing out what remained of the shattered monument and replacing it with something almost embarrassingly simple: a single wooden table, the kind you'd find in any modest kitchen, where his captains now sat for actual conversations instead of memorized decrees. He kept exactly one rule, handwritten this time instead of carved, framed above the table where everyone could see it. Trust is earned in daylight, not enforced in shadow. That's it? Amara asked, arms crossed, surveying his new masterpiece of restrained interior design. One rule? After 99? 98 of the others were fear wearing a nice suit, he said. I only needed to keep the one that was actually true. And the 99th? Never forgive betrayal. He looked at her, something soft finally allowed to live openly on his face. I'm working on rewriting that one too. Turns out forgiveness isn't weakness. It just took the right person breaking enough rules to show me that. She smiled, the same unbothered, sunlight disguised as troubled smile she'd worn the very first morning, sitting in his chair, asking why nobody in that house knew how to laugh. Somewhere behind them, Cupcake let out a contented sigh and flopped across both their feet, thoroughly done with Mafia intrigue for the day, and firmly of the opinion that belly rubs were the only rule worth enforcing going forward. The painting, for what it's worth, got finished eventually, restored, whole, hanging once again in the estate's east wing. But the real restoration had happened somewhere else entirely, in a boy who'd spent 20 years being told love was a liability, finally learning it was the one rule that had been worth breaking every single time. Seoul's rain kept falling that night, same as always. But for the first time in 2 decades, nobody in that house flinched at the sound of it. If you believe love is stronger than every rule built out of fear, hit subscribe right now, because only the Taesungs of the world, the manipulators hiding behind stone tablets and false loyalty, would scroll past a story like this without sharing it. Everyone else already knows exactly which side they're on.